Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you very much, President Etlin, for the very kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, President Etlin, Dr. Morgan, Mayor Reed, Mr. Grasso, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank very much the Center for the Study of Canada at SUNY Plattsburgh for the honor of inviting me to be the visiting fellow. Just wanted to thank Professor Kirky, to thank Amy Southerton, Charisse Granger, for all that they have done to make this visit so hospitable. I wanted in particular also to thank President Etlin for the dinner last night that unfortunately had to be canceled, but I really do appreciate that hospitality. You've heard the description tonight, and the word distinguished just appears too often. I'm not at all sure when I look at the list of folks who have come to deliver this distinguished Canadian lecture since 2003. I'm just simply not at all sure that I am in that kind of company, distinguished. Perhaps the one thing that I could offer is that I've got the right color hair for this. I'd like to thank Paul Grasso and the Development Corp very much for sponsoring tonight's Distinguished Canadian Address, and I'd also like to thank Fulbright Canada for its support. I'd also like to take this opportunity before I begin with the discussion tonight. I'd like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to two colleagues, one of whom is here and one of whom is not, although we could sort of say that he was here in spirit. But Chris Kirky and Michael Hawes have both separately as individuals and together as a team really played a huge and important role in advancing and sustaining Canadian studies in the United States over the years. And I just wanted to take this kind of public opportunity to express my own personal gratitude as a Canadian who has both a scholar's interest and a citizen's interest in the vitality of Canadian studies in the United States, and wanted to thank them for the excellent job they've done. I just want to ask all of you to thank Chris and to thank Michael in absentia. Tonight I want to address a simple issue, a very simple issue, the Trump challenge, and ask a very simple question. Has the election of Donald J. Trump in 2016 ushered in a new era in Canadian-American relations? As to the issue, I think it's safe to say that Mr. Trump is a challenge. He's a particular challenge for Americans who have to deal with the short and the longer-term consequences of a president who is truly unlike any chief executive in your nation's history. He's a challenge for friends, allies, and trading partners of the United States who must deal with this president's unorthodox view of global politics, of international diplomacy, of global trade, and in particular, his explicit embrace of an America First approach to the world. And, truth be told, he's also a challenge for those in global politics who wish America ill. For it's no easy task to deal with his profound lack of knowledge about the world, his unpredictability, and it seems to me, as a political scientist, most importantly, the deep disjuncture between what the president says on the one hand and what the vast and powerful apparatus of the American state, to use what political science terms, what that apparatus does on the other. Indeed, the challenge, it seems to me, comes from the very essence of this presidency. An essence that was captured perfectly, in my humble estimation, by The Economist magazine. 2 weeks after Mr. Trump's inauguration, The Economist, as some subscribers may remember, The Economist ran a cover entitled "An Insurgent in the White House." And it was illustrated with a brilliant image of Mr. Trump in one of his MAGA hats throwing a Molotov cocktail. Or, as one of Mr. Trump's more clueless surrogates, Scotty Nell Hughes, thought they were called, a Muzzletoff cocktail. It can be argued that this is precisely what those 62.9 million Americans who voted for Mr. Trump got: an insurgent in the White House, who spent his first year in office throwing a variety of Muzzletoff cocktails indiscriminately around. Some, as we all know in this room, have been directed at the institutions, the norms, and the political processes of the American Republic. Others have been directed outwards, at the international system as a whole, at America's friends, their partners, allies, rivals, and indeed, yes, enemies. Mr. Trump's insurgent inclinations are as challenging for Canadians and for Canada as for all others in the international system. But for Canada, the challenge comes from the huge disruption caused by the fact that for the first time since 1945, American voters have elected a president who openly, unapologetically, unambiguously calls into question both the liberal international order that the US brought into being after 1945 and America's role in maintaining that order. And it's really important to keep in mind, to remind ourselves, that Mr. Trump has held this skeptical view of the liberal international order all his adult life. He first articulated the critique in the 1980s when he accused friends and trading partners of the United States and allies of the US of brilliantly manipulating Americans in order that we foreigners could grow rich while American taxpayers were providing us foreigners with free security. Indeed, as he put it in an open letter to the American people in September of 1987, the world, he said, is laughing at Americans. Let's not let our great country be laughed at anymore. Now, as candidate and as president, Mr. Trump has echoed that long-standing skepticism. But in doing so, he's openly denigrated all of the key foundation stones of contemporary Canadian foreign policy: the North Atlantic Alliance, multilateralism as a sort of approach to global politics, and North American free trade. I want to go through each. First, Mr. Trump has been openly dismissive of the North American Alliance, the North Atlantic Alliance, both in public and in private. And it's clear that the president actually doesn't really understand how NATO works. He seems to think that the North Atlantic Alliance is little more than a sort of a grubby protection racket, where the smaller states are assumed to owe large sums of money to the US directly for the protection that is provided to them over the years. And we can see his critical view of NATO in his demands, for example, that France and Germany pony up, send large sums of money in back pay to the United States for all of those years of protection. We can see it in his musing, his open musing, about whether or not the United States would in fact make good on its commitment under Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty to those allies who are not paying America enough for their protection. We can see it in particular in how he behaved at a private dinner in Brussels in May at NATO, when he decided to throw away, he had two versions of speeches, one written by the so-called adults in the room that was sort of a standard kind of pro-NATO speech. The other speech that he had in his pocket was written by Steve Bannon, Steve Miller. You kind of have a sense of what that would say. But Mr. Trump decided to essentially put both of the speeches aside and instead go off script and improvise. And the result, according to all those who were there, was not particularly edifying and revealed really what Mr. Trump thought and thinks, I would argue, about NATO. Now, American behavior, in other words, the behavior of the state apparatus, has been much more ambiguous than Mr. Trump's words. For much of 2017, because there wasn't a permanent representative to NATO until August, the end of August, Americans were clearly missing in action in the leadership councils of the alliance. But importantly, American boots were nonetheless still and always on the ground in places in Europe that mattered. But the disjuncture is nonetheless unnerving, since, in a sense, it seems to me we'll never really know what Trump we're getting on the question of NATO. We know that Mr. Trump might on occasion read words off his teleprompter, put there by his speechwriters, but it's not altogether clear, judging from his private communications, that he actually believes those words. By contrast, unscripted Trump, whether he's on Twitter or at rallies, or when he's thrown away his speeches, as he did in Brussels, unscripted Trump always says what he really thinks. And by that measure, we need to be highly skeptical about whatever teleprompter Trump says about NATO. Secondly, Mr. Trump has been openly and unremittingly critical of multilateralism as an approach to American foreign policy. Basically, one could put it in simple terms, he believes that foreigners have basically screwed Americans by taking advantage of the US via multilateral institutions and by multilateral processes. In Mr. Trump's telling, America has been demeaned, as he put it, by countries that treat the US unfairly, with those countries and their leaders laughing at us, as he put it in June 2017, echoing that earlier concern from the 1980s. It's come thus as no surprise that one of Mr. Trump's first actions as president was to abandon the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a free trade agreement that the United States itself had taken a lead in shaping. Nor was it a surprise when he announced the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord, and claiming in so doing that the agreement was simply, as he put it, the latest example of Washington entering into an agreement that disadvantages the United States to the exclusive benefit of other countries. And finally, it's come as no surprise at all that the administration has sought to essentially undermine the World Trade Organization by refusing to fill vacant seats on the WTO's appellate body, a move that Forbes magazine, for example, has characterized as an attempt to vandalize the WTO. Finally, Mr. Trump, as everyone in this room knows, has been unflinching in his denigration of trade with other countries that result in trade deficits for the United States. He's been particularly critical of free trade agreements that, in his view, are unfair and always work in the interests of foreigners and not of Americans. And in the case of the North American Free Trade Agreement, on numerous occasions, he said that this is the very worst deal that the United States has ever signed. And indeed, he spent much of his campaign promising that he'd renegotiate NAFTA so that it was more fair to the United States, or else he'd simply withdraw from the agreement. Now, taken together, these elements of America First policy basically go to the very heart, attack the very heart of Canada's conception of the international system. Since the late 1940s, Canadians have made the Atlantic Alliance the center of our global policy. Likewise, for Canada, like for most other small states in global politics, multilateralism remains the preferred approach for dealing with global issues, and for clear and obvious reasons. The creation and maintenance of multilateral institutions that are able to develop through global consensus, and that includes the consensus of all the great powers, a rules-based approach to global governance that's been seen by Canadians and most other small countries for at least 70 years as a crucial mechanism for resolving the conflicts that will always be there in global politics. Finally, Mr. Trump's attacks on NAFTA strike at an institution that has come to be central to the Canadian approaches to international trade. And we need to remember that these last 24 years, NAFTA represents a significant transformation for Canadians, because Canadians had spent the entire 20th century trying hard to avoid a free trade agreement with the United States, beginning with the election in 1911, where Canadian voters actually threw out a government that had negotiated a free trade agreement with the US, threw them out of office. And the lessons of 1911 hung very heavily over Canadian politics throughout the decades of the 20th century. And it wasn't until Brian Mulroney and the Progressive Conservatives came to power in 1984 that changed. And even then, Mr. Mulroney came to power in 1984 having promised the previous year that he would never sign a free trade agreement with the United States. Why? Because that decision, he claimed to the voters, had been made way back in 1911. But when Mr. Mulroney saw the depth of protectionism that was facing trade in North America, he changed his mind in 1985, negotiated a comprehensive free trade agreement with the Ronald Reagan administration, and won the 1988 election, and successfully managed to trilateralize free trade negotiations between Canada, the US, and Mexico. Now, the overall success of NAFTA in the quarter century after 1994 has fundamentally changed Canadian views of free trade. The growth of Canadian wealth, the clear and unambiguous growth of Canadian wealth since 1994, in the aggregate, has meant that Canadians today remain strongly committed to the idea that continentalized supply chains and the increasing integration of the North American economy constitute a positive outcome, certainly for Canadians. Now, what's really important to recognize here is that the contribution of the Canadian welfare state to this positive view is crucial. Because as we all know, NAFTA brought with it, just as economists had promised, a considerable degree of economic disruption that affected huge numbers of Canadian jobs, particularly in manufacturing. But here's the crucial element. The Canadian welfare state, particularly the provision of universal health care, cheap college tuition, relatively generous unemployment benefits, provided a huge and, in my view, sufficient cushion that we never saw in Canada, the kind of economic and social dislocation to communities that we've seen in some parts of the United States. We haven't seen what clearly has been the case in the United States, where we have seen dislocation that produces the kind of American carnage that Mr. Trump spoke of in his inaugural address. And as a result, we haven't seen in Canada the emergence of a sort of a Trump-like political movement that's been able to capitalize on carnage, because there hasn't been that kind of carnage to the people who lost their jobs through dislocation, as Mr. Trump was able successfully to do in 2015 and 16. Now, when you look at the president's attacks on NATO, on multilateralism, on NAFTA, you might think that having an insurgent in the White House lobbing Molotov cocktails at things that Canadians hold dear might transform the relationship. And I want to suggest tonight, and which is why I put the question mark at the end of the title, I want to suggest tonight that, in fact, paradoxically, we've not seen any new relationship emerge as a result of the Trump challenge. Canadian-American relations, on the contrary, have remained on a remarkably consistent and steady trajectory. Now, some of this can be attributed to the very careful diplomacy of Justin Trudeau, the Liberal Prime Minister, who has demonstrated a high degree of discipline in his relations with President Trump. There are very few, as all of you know, very few similarities between these two guys. And on policy issues, they absolutely do not see eye to eye on virtually anything. But Mr. Trudeau has worked hard to avoid any kind of conflict with Mr. Trump, and usually by the simple expedient of refusing to say anything about the president. Instead, Mr. Trudeau resorts to what in essence has become a standard line. And he put it immediately after the election, that Canadians expect their government to have a constructive working relationship with the incoming American administration, and that's exactly what we're going to do, he said. And that's exactly what he has done, mainly by dancing around efforts, in particular by the media, to elicit a quote-worthy response from him on things that happen to the South. For example, after Mr. Trump allegedly referred to a number of states in other parts of the world in rather uncomplimentary language, Mr. Trudeau was asked at a news conference what his reaction was. And his reaction demonstrates nicely how one can easily avoid headlines that might come to the attention of Fox News and thence to a notoriously thin-skinned president. Mr. Trudeau's response was simple. I think you all know, he said, that I'm not going to opine on what the president may or may not have said. I'll simply repeat that Canada is a country of openness, of respect, and will continue to be there to support friends around the world and to welcome people who will contribute to building a stronger country. You can't take that word string and do anything else with it except be happy. Now, another factor, particularly in the early days of the relationship, was indeed Ivanka Trump and the Canadian government's decision to engage in what has been called daughter diplomacy. And essentially that is by appealing to Ms. Trump's policy interests in women in business. And indeed, one former high-ranking Canadian diplomat looking at the relationship between the president's daughter and the Canadian Prime Minister would be prompted to say, it's just so Game of Thrones. But daughter diplomacy has been just one strand of the Trudeau government's tactics for coping with the Trump challenge, particularly on NAFTA. Because the government has tried hard to engage as many American leaders outside the White House to press that one key Canadian interest, and that is saving NAFTA. Thus, Canadian diplomacy has been directed at members of Congress, particularly from those states where job losses would be greatest in the case of a termination, governors and legislators at state levels, and even key municipalities have been targeted. So that, for example, yesterday, Mr. Trudeau began a 3-day visit to the United States to press the benefits of NAFTA. He met with the governor of Illinois. He met with the mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel, before heading to California, where tomorrow he's going to deliver a speech, nicely and ironically, to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation about the benefits of free trade. But it's not just Canadian federal government officials that are involved in this. The premiers of the provinces have been active, so that, for example, yesterday, Premier Kathleen Wynne was in Washington, meeting with, in New York yesterday, meeting with business leaders, in Washington on Tuesday, lobbying the chief NAFTA negotiator. In short, the Trudeau government describes this as a full court press, and it even invokes the old naval slogan of all hands on deck. And indeed, it has been a bipartisan effort to put as many conservative hands on deck as liberal ones. And so that, for example, Brian Mulroney has been brought in, he, the Conservative Prime Minister from 1984 to 93, who negotiated the first free trade agreement with the United States and then NAFTA. Mulroney's become a key player in the Liberal strategy, and he has consistently lent his voice to the campaign, most recently in very powerful testimony before the United States Senate in January, at the end of January, and openly contradicting Mr. Trump on the benefits of NAFTA, though not by name. But there's another reason why Canadian-American relations are on a relatively even keel despite the assaults on those core interests. And that is that Canadians, like many other friends and allies and partners of the United States, have begun to make their peace with the prospect that the era of American leadership in global affairs may be coming to an end. Because many in the international system recognize that the election of Mr. Trump was in fact a reflection of a wider disaffection among Americans about America's role in the world. And so even if Mr. Trump's presidency came to an end tomorrow, there's a huge amount of damage in American conceptions of their country's role in the world that would have to be changed. And most of us know that if the voters gave the world Mr. Trump once, they can do so again with another kind of leader who has this kind of skepticism about American leadership. And hence, it seems to me that what we've seen is the adoption of an increasingly Zen view of the insurgency. Thus, for example, rather than simply ceding leadership to the People's Republic of China in Asia-Pacific trade, which is what Mr. Trump's abandonment of the Trans-Pacific Partnership would have done, instead what happened was that Japan and Australia stepped up and provided leadership to create a new, what they call comprehensive and progressive agreement for a Trans-Pacific Partnership, but without the United States. And indeed, the new TPP was a carefully calculated snook cocked directly at the United States, right down to the date on which the agreement was signed, 1 year to the day after Mr. Trump had withdrawn from the TPP. In a similar fashion, on the question of the Paris Climate Accord, all the other member states have essentially agreed that they're simply going to proceed without the United States. And indeed, many are reaching out, as many of you know, to American states and cities, many of which are taking a very different view about the notion that climate change is indeed the hoax that the president suggests it is. On security, in Europe, what we're seeing is that other members of NATO are essentially now ignoring the president, recognizing the wisdom of Angela Merkel's comments after the very discordant G7 meeting last year. And as she put it, the times in which we could rely fully on others, she said, they are somewhat over. And what she then went on to say is that we really have to take our fate into our own hands. And in Canada, what we've seen, it seems to me, is the embrace of what might be called defiant resignation on the challenges that Mr. Trump poses to Canada's core interests. On the one hand, there is a defiant insistence that Mr. Trump's narrow, transactional views of the benefits to Americans of the liberal international order, including the free trade regimes, is simply wrong. And an equally defiant attempt to press for outcomes that are rather different, and certainly in Canada's interests. And finally, a defiant assertion that is beginning to be made more and more frequently that no deal on NAFTA is better than a bad deal. And that latter defiant assertion also reflects a kind of resigned view of the possibility that the counterinsurgency operation may fail. But here, the view is Zen too. Canadians, it is said, survived the abrogation of the last free trade agreement with the United States. And that was back in 1866 when the Congress abrogated the Reciprocity Treaty of 1854 that created a free trade area between Canada, what was then the various British North American colonies, and Canada. Canadians, it is said, survived the Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930. And so, Canada, it is said, will survive should Mr. Trump choose to terminate NAFTA. And indeed, Canadians, like many others, recognize that the major losers in the case of the termination of NAFTA will indeed, ironically, be Americans. For the fact is that if the US withdraws, then the market will simply work its magic. Currencies will adjust in value, trade will continue, albeit with WTO tariffs rather than under the NAFTA regime, and whatever increased costs will simply be passed on to American consumers. And in the meantime, the American Enterprise Institute, no less, has estimated that over 1.8 million American jobs, the vast majority in the service sector, interestingly enough, will be lost in the dislocation. And again, ironically, in the very regions where voters brought into Mr. Trump's idiosyncratic views of trade and voted for him. In short, then, in one sense, Mr. Trump does pose a challenge to Canada and to many other friends, allies, and partners of the US. But Canadians, like Mexicans, know that the relationship with the United States, whatever the challenges that might be thrown up by American voters, that relationship doesn't actually change. For Canadians, as for Mexicans, the essence of the relationship actually hasn't changed that much, the essence of it, over the last number of years. Canadians, for their part, have always been exceedingly tightly bound to the United States, and that is not going to change regardless of the challenges. Thank you very much.